Great. Hello, all. Thank you so much for joining us for an inaugural gathering of Research Bites. My name is Taylor Pate, and I'm the multimedia and marketing assistant for the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. The monthly Research Bites series is one of many programs that we've initiated to celebrate the center's 25 years of engaging scholars, students, staff, and community members in interdisciplinary scholarship and programming around the topics of race and ethnicity. Thank you to Tiara, our center's program administrator, for thinking up and bringing to life this series. And thank you to Anna Dalal, our director of communications, and Indidi Opar, our multimedia and marketing, my fellow multimedia and marketing assistant, for their work behind the scenes. Our goal for the series is to connect staff from across the university with faculty affiliates of the center who study, teach, and write about race and ethnicity. We wanted to create an informal and interactive space where staff can learn firsthand about some of the exciting research happening on campus, and to provide an opportunity for faculty and staff to network with hope that we will find some shared interests and possibilities for future collaborations. You can subscribe to our Research Bites and CSRPC newsletter to be notified of future conversations. The first 25 staff members to register for Research Bites events will receive a $20 Grubhub credit to buy lunch online. Congratulations to those who are enjoying their lunches right now. We apologize for any confusion, but want to emphasize that these perks are reserved for staff only, but we welcome the students in the Zoom room. So today we are joined by two very special guests, Nell Crittenden and Lisa Moore. Nell Crittenden is a lecturer at the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice, where she teaches Black women work, the labor of Black women in communities, families, and institutions. Nell's work as an anti-oppressive researcher and educator includes leading comparative studies on culturally responsive and trauma-informed pedagogy in higher ed classrooms, and expanding intersectional feminist frames to inform domestic violence research advocacy agendas. Lisa Moore is a senior lecturer and the director of the Master of Arts in Social Work and Social Welfare program at the University of Chicago Crown Family School of Social Work, Policy, and Practice. She has extensive teaching and administrative experience. Her current research includes two different projects. The first is the intersections of race, racism, and psychodynamic/psychoanalytic theories. Her second research project is exploring relationships in intentional housing communities in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and Chicago, Illinois. So please give a warm welcome to our friends and faculty members, Nell Crittenden and Lisa Moore.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really happy to be here today. So for this presentation, Nell and I are going to split it up, and I will start off by saying that it's a great honor to be here. I love talking about this work that Nell and I have been doing for the past now 2 years. And this research project came about when after we finished the first iteration of the course Black Women Work, Nell said we should really capture this. And other people had asked me how the class went, and I said it was amazing. It was one of the most transformative classes I'd ever taught. And so the brainchild of this research project was very much Nell Crittenden, who will speak more to the organization of the research project itself. And so I said, let's do it. And so I was really happy to have this opportunity to sort of spend time with Nell and to dig in and to really think about why this class worked. What were the components that made this class work? I think a lot of us who teach are oftentimes thinking about, what makes a successful class. In the context of Black women's labor, because this class was also designed and developed by two Black women who both work quite a bit, we were interested in better understanding how do we communicate to people what are the components of making this class work. We used a co-teaching model for this course, which co-teaching is something that I feel has a lot of value when it is done well. And so Nell and I created this course in large part because we wanted to co-teach. For myself, some of my more transformative experiences in graduate school was when I was in courses that were co-taught. And my approach to co-teaching is not that we equally separate sort of like who does one day of class, who does another day of class. My approach is that we work together to create an experience that reflects the strengths of both of us as teachers and as scholars. So I'll share a little bit of about myself, and then I will pass it along to Nell Crittenden. So could you advance the slide one slide, please? So this is just a little bit of bio background about me. I'm originally from Washington, D.C. and Charlotte, North Carolina. My scholarship, I'm actually not doing the scholarship on housing so much, it's really on race and psychoanalysis, Black women's labor, and LGBTQ intergenerational dialogue. And I'm a parent to a 16-year-old son and a 9-year-old gender non-binary child. And so for us in the Black feminist tradition of teaching and thinking, it's common for people to include positionality statements. And so I will also share that I am a very Black feminist identified scholar and thinker. And I sort of think of these positionality statements as almost like little prayers. And so when you read the work of a lot of Black feminists, almost all of the folks who write from a Black feminist framework position themselves. So at this point, I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to let Nell share a little bit about who she is, and then get us started on the actual research presentation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lisa, and thank you so much to the CSRPC and everyone for being here. Yes, my name is Nell Crittenden. In addition to lecturing at the Crown Family School, social work policy and practice, I'm also a senior implementation research coordinator for the University of Chicago. So I do that for full-time work. I am originally from Portland, Oregon. And so I definitely do call Portland, Oregon, and it's typically consistent weather patterns home. But you know, everything with weather is just kind of all over the place, so we'll see. Here you'll see just a little bit more about my academic and research background. And so I attended Willamette University in Salem, Oregon and I graduated with my Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Political Theory, also a double minor in American Ethnic Studies and Women and Gender Studies. I took a couple of years, I took a gap year and a half and went back to school at the Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Practice, and graduated in 2022 with my Master of Arts in Social Work. And then just very broadly, my scholarship background revolves very heavily around Black feminist and womanist research, also survivor-driven domestic violence and sexual violence advocacy, and lastly, intersectional epistemic justice. I have a project in addition to this research project that I'm currently working on that's looking more at how to utilize survivor-driven frameworks in domestic violence research. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that today, but there's a little bit about who I am. And to add my own positionality statement, I am a very proud, queer, fat Black woman. I use she and her pronouns, and would totally echo Lisa in that I definitely believe that positionality statements are akin to prayers and just ritualistic in nature. And so I'm really excited to share a little bit about that today.
Oh, how are you doing?
You can feel free to go to the next slide. So here, perfect, thank you. Here are just two photos of our Black woman work class. So like Lisa was saying, we have taught it for 2 years. And so the photo on the right is just a smaller group of our 2022 cohort. And then the photo on the left, where you see Lisa is there virtually, is a photo of our entire class from our 2023 cohort, and it was amazing. So we just wanted to share these really cool photos with you. Okay, awesome. So I wanted to kick us off with some grounding definitions. And so in our class, we were guided by and we did our best to offer Black feminist, intersectional, and decolonized definitions and framings of oppression, labor, and womanhood in our intentional and inclusive centering of Black women's vast experiences. And so we begin our presentation with definitions in order to ground the conversations that we'll have today in anti-oppression. So to start is misogynoir. Dr. Moya Bailey, in her book Misogynoir Transformed in 2021, defined misogynoir as describing the uniquely co-constitutive racialized and sexist violence that befalls Black women as a result of their simultaneous and interlocking oppression at the intersection of racial and gender marginalization. And so this is a definition that we use that really captured not only Black women's oppression, but the ways in which Black women are navigating various forms of racist and sexist violence and oppression. You can go to the next slide. Thank you. So next, we present the specific definition of woman, as we found that it is impossible to be intentionally intersectional and inclusive to all types of Black women without explicitly stating who we include when we're talking about women. And so when we are talking about women, experiences of Black womanhood, and why it matters to challenge heteronormative and capitalistic notions of gender in this course, we acknowledge that woman, however we are using it, is inclusive of cisgender, transgender, trans, non-binary, agender, and gender variant folks whose experiences of misogynoir are intimately connected with their identity and or how they have been socialized as belonging to this gender identity. And so, like Moya Bailey does in her book, we also encourage and challenge our students and you all to think of Black women first when you see the word woman. We challenge you to think of queer and trans women first when you read the term Black woman. And when you read the term Black feminists, that you do not assume it is interchangeable with Black women. Right? So this is an effort of grounding our conversation today. For labor, the definition of labor for this class is inclusive of the energy Black women have put forth in the distinct spheres of the human ecosystem that contributes to the systems required for existence. This is an excerpt from our syllabus. And so we say this because this course draws heavily on a Black feminist theoretical framework. And since to understand the labor of Black women, one needs to understand the inseparability of the personal, professional, and systemic components of the life of Black women. These components reside in our government, our schools, social media, underground economies. Sorry, could you back up one slide, please? Just to the labor slide. Underground economies, thank you so much, and knowledge making, and we observe the energy and the labor that Black women contribute to articulating their presence for the good of the world as a whole. And so before we go to the next slide, we recognize that, like, talking about Black women's experiences could be grounded in pretty much any institution, pretty much any frame. And so we chose labor because, and this is mostly Dr. Moore when she was forming the class, we chose labor because so much of Black women's lives is narrated through the work that we do. And often, not just the work that we do for ourselves, but the work that we do for other people. And as many of us know, the scholarship doesn't always capture the ways in which labor and energy doesn't always capture our labor and energy, and it doesn't always capture the ways that this energy moves through different spheres, nor does it capture the output of our energy in terms of where is it going, whether that's to parenting or organizing or some other different type of work. And so work and labor are socially constructed expectations, which often determine survival in individualistic and capitalistic societies like the United States, as well as governments who are beholden to Western values, which includes a lot of territory on the globe. So if you could go to the next slide. I wanted to spend some time really trying to contextualize why we chose these dimensions. So the course, to reiterate, is called Black Women Work, the labor of Black women in communities, families, and institutions. And so this class explores how the labor of Black women has contributed to each of these categories and how the ways that the labor of Black women's bodies, inclusive of cis, transgender, transgender and non-binary bodies, become the site for embodiment or disembodiment of Black women's labor. And so I'm going to start with communities. So we chose communities because community is a complex site of different spaces where Black women are expected to show up as supports, expert navigators, sentries, lookouts, disruptors, stabilizers, champions, and so much more. As social workers, Dr. Lisa Moore and I are both social workers, and one thing that we do is use a both and perspective. And using that perspective, we can see that communities is a site where Black women often thrive at the same time, right? But it's also a site where Black women are tasked with structuring physical and non-physical spaces through labor that is invisibilized, non-compensated, and akin to the duties of a multi-site project coordinator, hands in every pot, and the expectations that everything will come out perfectly. And the way that these expectations are communicated in the realm of community is often through holding people, neighborhoods, and community-centered investment principles in the highest regard. That becomes our job. Understanding the ways in which Black women's labor is community labor is really important because our work tends to also highlight how community labor can go as unacknowledged labor. I want to move to institutions here. So we engage with institutions because anti-Blackness, sexism, misogynoir, and other forms of oppression based in identity, privilege, and access to resources are baked into the DNA of the United States. And because of that, they're also baked into the DNA of other Western and capitalistic nations. And so these same so-called values of anti-Blackness, sexism, and misogynoir that are reflected in the DNA of these nations also represent the principles that govern this regime, and they're embedded into the everyday institutions of power that we navigate. So from education to the economy, to media, the government, democracy, law, religion, family, these each represent institutions that Black women have been simultaneously expected to accept marginal access to these power structures, all while our labor has been demanded to uphold them, right? So this both and of our labor and our work is required to uphold these institutions that also disempower us in the same breath, and being forced into spaces where we have to accept that. And what happens after that, right? Sometimes there is acceptance and then sometimes there is not. And so understanding the formal roles of the relationships between Black women and institutions is key, and understanding the forms of labor that are requested of us in these spaces. So to see how Black women continue activating to transform these spaces through knowledge building and freedom fighting, regardless of if we are actively invited into these spaces or welcome into these spaces, we're deeply impacted by their inaccessibility, and we're deeply impacted by their roots in white supremacy culture and racist, sexist tropes throughout various realms of institutions. Moving to the families bracket. So while family is also an institution, and I referenced this a little bit earlier, in the class, we explore it as another space where Black women often show up and produce labor that can be invisibilized or uncompensated or both. It's no surprise that Black women play a particular role of holding people, part of the family unit together in the midst of the trauma of living in a racist, sexist, ableist, and classist society. Family operates as a site where gender roles exist and are highlighted, and societal norms continue to dictate what women can take on. And so women are continuously tasked with a lot of the emotional and unseen labor that goes into upholding a family network. Family is a site where Black women have proven to have a lot of power and voice in family dynamics, child rearing, and the social emotional development of others. So going back to the both and perspective, because while that is true, the child rearing and social emotional development of others, those responsibilities are often prioritized over the health and the wellness of self. On the flip side, family can also be and is often a site of Black women's trauma, stress, harm, and distress. And that's often caused by other members in the family unit. And so the opportunities and expectations for Black women to put forth labor and to foster the growth of others in the midst of gender-based abuse in the home is a reality for so many Black women. And that makes it a site that deserves further exploration. I want to highlight the self bracket here because this was an implicit domain that wasn't explicitly stated, but the self and healing that emerged as a domain of the course. And in that, it revealed that we must always discuss the ways in which Black women are engaging with healing. That has to always be at the forefront of our minds. It's notable that statistically, Black women tend to be in helping professions. We overrepresent in helping professions. And within that, it's important to hold space for the ways in which we take care of ourselves, the ways in which we prioritize the self and our own healing, and also the ways that like conversations on our own healing and self-work can take up space when we're talking about labor, because self-care and healing work is work. It is labor. And within that, the labor of self-care and healing is something that we need to be more engaged with, as neglecting this has proven to be detrimental and have detrimental impacts on our physical, mental, and emotional health. And so wanted to provide this diagram because it's critical in providing space in the class. It's critical that when we are providing space in the class, we are doing so to analyze what is classified as work, and what the social, communal, institutional, and systemic expectations of work are, and how those have been embedded into the expectations that we have for ourselves as individuals and also as a community. And I do want to note that as a variable, so returning to the conversation of why labor, as a variable, labor presents a very unique view of Black women's experiences of working in a variety of capacities that sometimes intersect. So sometimes, on this diagram, community, self, families, and institutions, they will intersect. Sometimes they don't. And so within this, it provides a very unique view of the shared experiences that we have navigating through systems of oppression. Labor also represents, for Lisa and I, the connective tissue that unites or contextualizes many Black women's experiences of trauma, survival, oppression, joy, hope, pleasure, freedom fighting, and overall well-being. Labor is a site where we can analyze all of it. And so if you could please go to the next slide. Thank you. So a point of reference is the ACRIT framework. So a little bit of context. As I stated, I graduated from the Crown Family School of Social Work in 2022. And so my second year field placement was at the National Center for Domestic Violence, Trauma, and Mental Health as a researcher. And in 2018, they developed the Accessible, Culturally Responsive, and Trauma-Informed, or ACRIT, framework as an organizational tool designed to create healing-centered care approaches to organizations serving survivors of domestic and sexual violence that are expressly survivor-driven. And so, diving into the ACRIT framework, I'm gonna give a brief overview of everything that's in the text box for ACRIT, and then I'm gonna spend a little bit of time on the ground. ACRIT understands accessibility through a structural lens. And so accessible is defined as the practice of ensuring that people of all kinds of abilities can fully access their agencies, resources, and environments with ease. Culturally responsive, in the context of the National Center, is defined in three parts, right? So the first articulates an approach that recognizes trauma as being collective, individual, ongoing, historical, and intergenerational. The second piece is that a culturally responsive approach is marked by seeking to identify the historical experiences of discrimination and oppression, and are committed to changing the conditions that contribute to the existence of abuse and violence in individuals' lives. And lastly, is marked by providing guidance on how trauma can affect people's experiences of services and reduce re-traumatization at organizational levels, right? And then lastly, for trauma-informed or a trauma-informed approach is defined as one that demonstrates mindfulness in how culture and systems of oppression shape identity, and thus people's experiences of trauma and healing. And so the ACRIT framework is nestled within an integrated care approach. And this represents work that is grounded in advocacy perspectives, work that incorporates an understanding of trauma and its effects, and work that creates accessible environments, recognizing the centrality of culture, and is always committed to human rights and social justice. So just positing to the left here in the bolded purple pieces, those 4 bolded purple pieces, I'm going to give you a quick review of the integrated framework. So following core principles or values provides a foundation for doing accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed work. Each of these pieces are all a part of creating a relational environment that can help to counteract people's experiences of trauma and dehumanization. One that is deeply respectful and honors and supports each person's experience, resilience, agency, and humanity. And so a couple of notes for the physical and emotional safety bracket. What the center articulates this to be is a consistent honoring of each person's understanding of what safety means for them, and a commitment to ongoing self-reflection and evaluation of whether the systems, the policies, or the lesson plans or procedures are actually facilitating feelings of safety, right, in real time, in reality. A little bit about the relationship and connection piece. Relationships are central to healing, growth, and change. And so as our relationships to the people, places, and practices grow, so should our practices. And so the National Center is really intentional in noting that harm often occurs in relationship, and the quality of our relationships as interactions have the potential to facilitate healing from experiences of abuse and discrimination, but also create a sense of connection and belonging. Moving to the hope and resilience bracket. Something notable here is that believing in the human capacity to survive and heal and recognize the strengths and resources that survivors already possess, those things are central to holding hope and resilience. So being a steady source of hope and acknowledgement, naming and reflecting people's profound resilience are critical parts of supporting survivors on their own terms while they heal from trauma. And then the last piece for the survivor-defined approach, a survivor-defined approach is cognizant to recognize and honor each person's right to determine and define what works for them, and guaranteeing choice and control over their experiences are key components of a survivor-defined approach. So all of that to say, of course this matters. And in summary, why does this matter? It matters because within the context of domestic violence research and advocacy, a core tenet of survivorship and survivorhood hinges on seeing, valuing, and respecting survivors of violence as more than the trauma they've experienced, and as people capable of living full lives who are also deserving of humanity and care. Next slide, please. So how does this connect, right? Our research question is, what does a culturally responsive classroom look like at the University of Chicago? And this connects to the Acrity framework, because while it wasn't our intention to focus on Acrity in this research, we found that there were several principles of the framework that were affirmed and echoed by our students. Next slide, please. So in our research, in exploring this question, our research methods were, we administered several anonymous course feedback surveys throughout the duration of the course, used those for evaluation in addition to blind UChicago standard evaluations at the end of the quarter. And we also interviewed students individually and in focus groups a few months after the course had concluded. And so we had two major findings from the research. We know that Acrity is an organizational and practice-based tool, but we found that adapting the Acrity domestic violence practice-based framework into an anti-oppressive pedagogy for social work curriculum on teaching Black feminist and womanist theory was successful. We found that critical reflection and reflection on the teaching experience centered our positionality as instructors, and that the impact on the course topics so the course topic is on Black womanhood, and the impact of having Black women instructors teach about Black womanhood and teach a course on Black feminist theory was very salient for our students. And so going through the finding one, throughout the course of this research, we found that students considered the impacts of the Acrity pedagogy to be monumental in their own personal, mental, emotional, and academic development as anti-oppressive scholars in the field. You'll see here that students describe the experience of learning in an Acrity classroom, one that is expressly accessible, culturally responsive, and trauma-informed, as one where they were able to foster the skills of critical reflection, compassion, active listening, as well as interpersonal and intrapersonal growth. Focus group and interview respondents particularly noted that the experience of being in the Black woman workforce made them feel as though their instructors valued them not just as students, so described here as more than the sum of their intellectual parts, but that their humanity and well-being as students past their capacity to engage in the labor of creating and producing knowledge, is what was valued by their instructors. And so this finding revealed to us that the impact of adapting Acrity, which is a model of viewing survivors of sexual and domestic violence as more than the trauma that they endured, can be transformational when applied to the classroom. Because what does it mean to view and understand students as human beings, as more than the intellectual knowledge they're capable of producing? And what does it mean to do this in a graduate social work course? Our next finding 2, we saw that in our analysis, students were genuinely excited to learn not just about anti-oppressive Black feminist theories on labor, but also how to engage with and understand the robustness of Black feminist praxis. And so by praxis, I mean applied theory. And so engaging with the robustness of Black feminist praxis in their professional, academic, and personal lives as it relates to transforming dense theory into accessible language in academic and non-academic spaces. We also found that, so one of the practices from Lisa and I is that our course definitions of labor and work were consistently evolving, and we invited students to collaborate with us in redefining labor through Black feminist perspectives. One of the purposes of this was to challenge existing definitions of the social lenses, excuse me, of the social constructions of work and labor, and to highlight the ways in which a lot of non-critical lenses on identity and power and labor don't actively include Black women in their definitions or in their analysis. And so we found that there were always new ways that students were engaging with and challenging socially accepted Western notions of belonging and labor, and that it was our job not to gatekeep this knowledge as instructors, but rather to foster a space where students can freely interact with and expand on the ideas in the course. And those were namely sprouting from Black feminist analyses of social problems. Next slide, please. I think we skipped one slide. Thank you. Okay, so answer to the research question. Our research question of what does a culturally responsive classroom look like at the University of Chicago? Our research revealed that a culturally responsive classroom at the University of Chicago looks like a learning environment in which educators consciously reimagine the classroom as a site for personal, professional, and intellectual growth. Next slide, please. So I'm just gonna, you all can feel free to read as deeply into these testimonials as you'd like. But I do want to note that this course has consistently represented undergraduate students, doctoral, graduate, and professional students from a variety of majors and disciplines. And I wanted to highlight student responses to the course that we received that were instrumental in designing the research project. And so our first finding around Acritty classrooms being welcoming, anti-oppressive, and necessary spaces. We thought it was very interesting that one of our PhD students noted that this was a class where they felt that the instructors were clear in stating that we were going to affirm people from all walks of life and from all identities. And so we also thought it was very interesting that the student noted they thought it was important that we set the tone out loud and made it very clear that we were going to have the expectation of being mindful, but also respectful and empathetic towards peers. I also wanted to highlight that for the second finding, we thought it was really interesting because the second finding highlights that learning Black feminism through anti-oppressive pedagogies is a vital part of one's education and life experience as a social change maker. And so a second-year master's student noted this by saying that traditional economic analyses and frameworks barely examine Black people's relationship to the political economy, let alone Black women. And so that was very telling for us. I won't go into all of the pieces, but it was very telling for us to receive that feedback during the class, and also a couple of months out from the class, and noting that the impact of the course and the impact of fostering an accessible and culturally responsive and a trauma-informed classroom, how our students were thinking about this and how they were entering into academic and non-academic spaces, having this experience, but also having this type of academic grounding in Black feminist theory. So can go to the next slide, please. That concludes the presentation. I did want to, pose a couple of questions to the audience. So the CQ stands for critical questions. These are questions that are extracted from our syllabus and how we encourage our students to think about Black women's labor. And so I posed them to all of you. How has the labor of Black women, how do you see the labor of Black women contributing to the sustainability of communities, families, and institutions? What are the choices you see Black women making to engage and sustain their work? And what is the future of the labor of Black women? Is the future one that is liberatory or not? And why? So I will pause there. I've been doing a lot of talking. I'll pause there. Yeah, and I'll open it up.
So it looks like we have one question now, and I'll read it off. Could you speak more about the choice of Acrity framework in terms of its conception of who a student is as they come into the classroom and the aims for transformation as the student leaves the course? I'm especially curious in terms of trauma and healing, what it means to center those in pedagogy. And so that's a great question. I can kind of, is it okay? I was going to.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, I mean, one reason we use Acrity, so Nell in the process of starting this project was already actively involved in writing a paper for the National Centers on Domestic Violence using the Acrity framework. And when we were talking about the course evaluations, when we met after the class to debrief and talk through sort of what we saw in the course evaluations, how the students spoke about their experiences in the course, Nell made the connection that Acrity may be a good way for us to examine and consider how we analyze the course, which I had not thought about it. My background in social work is actually, my subspecialty is working with adult survivors of childhood violence and sexual assault and incest. And so I was like, I had never thought about that, but it makes sense, right? Because a lot of the narratives we heard from students in the very first day of class were narratives of experiences of harm that they had experienced in classrooms, often classrooms that they were experiencing on campus. And so it made sense that we actually use that, because even before we got to anyone's personal history, people came in with what I can only describe as some sort of like educational trauma related to the intersections of race and gender. And we got that just from the classroom introductions on the first day. And so I think that Acrity made a lot of sense to forefront that. And what I have found since this particular project is that I sort of have started using that framework in a lot of places. And I find, because a lot of the work that I do is around, race and people, it is very applicable. Like, it's very, very helpful to use that framework, I would say. Did you want to add anything to it? No?
Yeah, your question made me think a lot about how, so yes, I'm very steeped in this work, still steeped in this work. And some of the parallels that I saw between scholarship on survivorship and survivorhood were really talking about these shared experiences of trauma and dehumanization, but also about the flow of power being vertical and top down. And so in the co-teaching experience with Lisa, I was also very drawn to, we have introductions on the first day of class, and that really sets the tone that helps to set the tone for the course. And I was, as a Black woman who has also survived my educational experience at historically and predominantly white institutions, I could relate to a lot of the different stories that students were sharing. And I thought that going back to analyze the course after everything had wrapped, I thought it was very interesting how the first reflections, we administer the first reflection for the course in week 3, and the last reflection is administered in week 8, which is right before finals. And I thought it was really interesting how students were talking about experiencing this transformation of how to talk about power, power structures and power flows when it comes to the experience of teaching and learning, but also how to talk about dehumanization in a very accessible way, in ways that aren't bogged down by very heavily political or just like dense academic jargon. And I thought that there were just too many parallels between the goals of survivorship and of acrity, which is, you know, creating a survivor-defined experience throughout the entire experience of care, seeing those parallels in the classroom. And so I hope that I'm answering your question to the person that asked it, but survivorship is about personhood. And I think that a lot of what being a student has become, a lot of the experience of being a student has become conflated with regurgitation and a willingness to participate in intellectualism, whether it's accessible or not. The willingness to partake in the labor of creating new knowledge and putting that at the forefront while also forsaking all other forms of well-being. And I think that one of the findings from the class, and that this is very notable because it is a social work class, but something that we were looking for is, you know, we are, as social workers teaching a course like this, we are going to be discussing heavy topics. And what is it that we can do to make sure that, you know, there are skills of critical reflection, active listening, and compassion being fostered as folks are preparing to enter into the field. And I just saw a lot of those conversations also happening in the survivorship spaces that I was in. So it became very clear that they were connected.
And so we have 2 more questions, and I'm going to try to sort of respond to both of them. At the end of the first question, there was a question about sort of like what it means in terms of trauma and healing to center those in the pedagogy. And it kind of connects with this next question. Can you describe how students interacted and how students interacted with you both throughout the course? What was the vibe and how did it differ from other classes that you've been in? So what I will say is that the class itself was a healing space, I would say. We did not think about healing when we were creating it. I was much more interested in, okay, I want to make sure I have good data and research about Black women's labor nationally, internationally. Like those are the types of things I was thinking about. Nell was thinking was very theory heavy. And so I think that what was interesting is that as the class flow was happening, things sort of emerged. And I would say that the first iteration of the class was very mixed. The racial demographics of the classroom itself were very, very mixed. We had students from all over. We had a couple of tiers actually in the introduction. And I'm sharing that because I thought it was significant that those tiers were not from women. They were actually from some of the men who felt like they had spent time in classes here where they had felt harmed. And I think that's significant because that actually set the tone for this first class where people felt a sense of like being held. And what was described to me by our doctoral students who were sitting in the class and kind of observing was that Nell and I just did a really good job of shaping it as a space where people could bring all of themselves into the classroom. And so I would say the vibe of the class was that, you know, people didn't, you know, not everyone knew each other. And by the end of the class, people were laughing and hanging out. And there was this sense, I mean, of any class that I've taught at UChicago, this is the class that consistently in both years where we have the most conflict and disagreement in conversations, and people still sort of hold it together. So I think that is notable that with the university commitment around academic freedom and things like that, that it doesn't seem to, I don't see this playing out as easily in other classes I've taught at UChicago. But I will say in this particular class, I think because people do feel like they are respected, they feel like their personhood is honored, they feel like they can actually speak more honestly and openly about topics and when they disagree with topics. And so there was this sense that we were all really and truly learning together. After the first year of teaching this course, I have stopped teaching this course when I'm teaching other courses because it's hard to make the shift of going from this classroom into a classroom where the topic and the themes feel different. And part of why it feels different is because there is a very deliberate reason I think students do sign up for the class. This year's demographics of the class was all Black with the exception of one, almost all Black, one white student, and then 2 visiting students from India in the class, who also and so again, it's a class that can hold all sorts of students, but there's a consistent theme of people feeling a sense of healing in the class. And so we have another question. Can you speak on how the demographic makeup of the student population in Academy classrooms at UChicago shape how emotional labor is distributed? Right. So I think I just spoke to some of that. So again, a lot of that really is, I think, tied to the fact that even though the classroom demographic was pretty, one year was very mixed, this year was pretty homogeneous. There is this sense of, oh, this is a classroom where everyone can bring their different thoughts and opinions about things. We have some students who are very sort of tied to their various religious practices and things like that. Everyone shows up as they are in that classroom. So any other questions for us? I will say, as someone who is co-teaching this with Nell, my biggest fear is what it's going to be like when Nell leaves to teach this class. It'll be really different to teach it either solo or with somebody new. So I will say that I have appreciated Nell's partnership on this. And, I think that's something that I will miss. Oh, what did the assignments look like? Oh, our assignments were fun.
Very fun.
Yeah, we have one assignment that Nell came up with, which was, oh my gosh, a job description. So we asked students to reimagine a job description using a Black feminist framework and considering what they've learned about sort of what Black women's labor is. And I would say another assignment in the class is we asked students, what's the other assignment?
Understanding and defining labor. So around the 4-week mark, we asked students to start conceptualizing or to really challenge their previous conceptualizations of labor using a Black feminist framework. So how would you define labor using a Black feminist framework, bringing all of your past experiences into the conversation?
And the final assignment for the class is that we ask students to collect oral histories of Black women's labor. So at this point, we have approximately 36 recordings of Black women talking about their work. And sort of how I think about it is like labor is the energy, labor is your passion, and work are the tasks, right? Like work is the stuff that we do to make things happen, but labor is like that energy, that passion that drives us. And so I think that, Nell and I made a very deliberative choice to, and Nina Askew, who's a student from the first year of the class, we are creating an archive of the labor histories. And so students identify women, Black women, to talk about their labor. And then Nell and Nina really are creating an archive on Omeka to store the stories. People give us permission to post their stories to it, and those are going to be posted. And we sort of see this class as a space to start collecting and creating an archive of Black women labor histories. And so that's the final assignment. And, I think we see ourselves as the custodians of Black women's labor histories. And that's what we are really having a good time doing.
Yep.
Mhm.
Great. Couldn't have said it better.
On that note, we are at time. But this was great. We will have the recording for you guys in a couple of days if you want to check it out on YouTube. But I want to say thanks everybody for joining today and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. Take